Welcome to In Real Time. I'm your host, Hunter. Today, we have an incredibly special guest, legend in the youth ministry world, legend at Eastern University, guy who's been in the game a really long time, really long time, but so much, ministered to so many people over the years. Darrell Pearson, Dr. Darrell Pearson. Darrell, how are we doing today?
Hey, I'm doing pretty well.
Good.
Yeah, thanks for having me on.
Yeah, thanks for being here. So tell us the Darrell Pearson story. Who are you? Where are you from? How'd you get to where you are?
Yeah, so I grew up in Denver, in a good church there where my church always had really good part-time youth ministers who were Denver Seminary students.
Mm-hmm.
And so I grew up in a family very ministry oriented. In fact, there were four boys in my family. Three of us became ministers, and the fourth actually, after a business career, became a business guy at his church.
Oh,
on
awesome.
so we all ended up kind of in the church world that way. So a good, strong family. My church. So we had a pretty good youth ministry when I was in high school. We're talking about in the late '60s into
Mm-hmm.
early '70s, and my youth pastor was a Denver student at the seminary named Lowell Bakke, and he was just so instrumental in planting that seed for me.
Yeah.
No, he did what so many youth pastors do, and I know he didn't do that for everybody, but he was a real leadership oriented kind of guy. And he had highlighted me and like as a junior to say, you need to consider being a youth minister yourself.
Mm-hmm.
At the time, my oldest brother was already in seminary, and my next brother had gone from a mechanical engineering or something into decided to go to seminary. So it became the family thing. And I'm like, I don't want to go to seminary because like everybody's like, oh, it's your family deal. Everybody goes to seminary. So I kind of stayed away from that. But Lowell kind of kept after me even after high school, and
Mm-hmm.
even after leaving the seminary and went into a church in Illinois. He still would keep. I would still hear from him once in a while because he was still kind of the mindset, you have ministry gifts. You need to consider this.
Yeah.
So when I got out of college, I actually spent a year selling office equipment for a company of a guy from my church. I known my whole life, and it was hard. It was very hard. It taught me that not just ministry is hard. Business people in the real world have really hard jobs.
Yeah.
Like selling where you don't get paid unless you sell something. Very stressful.
Yes.
It'd be like a church saying, if you have 10 kids come to youth group this week, you get your salary. But if you only have one, you're getting 1/10.
Yeah.
You're like, that's not fair, but it's like, that's how selling works, right? So,
That's the pressure. Yeah.
but at the end of a year of doing that, and I was like the youngest guy in the company, the youngest sales guy by about 15 years, and learning from a guy. It was in the town I went to college in, Fort Collins. And I had all this great opportunity, but it's like, I was just not fulfilled doing that.
Yeah.
And I started, really thinking like what Lowell had kind of planted in me, do you want to do this your whole life? And I just thought, I don't want to be selling stuff my whole life.
Right.
So I started asking around a little bit like that. Even the president of my company, the guy that I'd worked for all through college, did this job. He's like, for the guy from my church, he's like, oh, I always knew you'd go to seminary because you have ministry gifts. And I said, well, what if it doesn't go well? And he said, you can always come back. We'd hire you back. You can come back. So it's like I had no risk, right? Just go
Yeah.
try. My pastor of my church was like, totally encouraging, So I was kind of not. It was not so much about individual gifts. I mean, individual call for
Yeah.
me. It's more community call for me. I know people have different ways they interpret call, right? Sometimes it's
Yeah.
very individual. Feel that the person is really tugging. God's calling on their heart. And for me, it was a lot of the community saying, you have gifts for this kind of work.
Mm-hmm.
And so that's what I eventually, after a year, I quit that and I went to seminary in Minnesota. I did an internship in Iowa at a church for first summer before seminary, and then the summer after my first year. And even that came about because a pastor randomly calls me from Des Moines, Iowa, and says, someone gave me your name and said you were interested maybe in doing an internship. And I said, no, what are you talking about? And he goes, well, I talked to Lowell Bakke. And Lowell, I hadn't talked to Lowell in about 3 years, right? The youth pastor.
Yeah.
And he's like, yeah, Lowell was pretty sure you'd be looking for a ministry opportunity for this. And I'm like, I can't get away from this guy, right? And then of
Yeah.
course I went on and do it.
Right.
And I have a great experience with it. I love the ministry work. I went to seminary, worked with junior high kids during seminary. Um, uh, Now I don't want the story to go too long too. How are we on time wise for this thing? Because I
We're
don't want
fine.
to. Okay,
We're
because like I
fine.
could go 4 or 5 hours, and I'm not even to 1985.
Right.
I'm kind
So
of old.
yeah, no, that's okay. No, that's good. Keep it rolling.
Okay, a little bit. So interesting that at the end of college, I met the girl who would become my future wife. But interestingly enough, she came from an Assembly of God background, and I was Baptist.
All right.
So that was a big concern in my family because ecumenical things in the 80s, late 70s, not as strong.
Yeah.
So as we got more serious, my family was kind of like, okay, well, they like her, but they're not sure what that means. And then as I was getting close to graduating, I met with the district secretary of my denomination, and Pastor Ed was this old guy who knew my family my whole life, and he said, "I don't know your wife at all." And both my brothers worked for him in the denomination in the Mount Rockies, right? And he
Yep.
said, "I don't know your wife at all, but you mentioned that she's a different denomination background." And he said, "What's she come from?" And I said, "She's out Assembly of God." And he looked at me. It looked like he saw a ghost. And he said, "Fort Collins is First Assembly of God." And he, in dead serious, he said, "She needs to join a Baptist church before you graduate, or you're not going to get a job." And that was the moment that I became a non-Baptist after a whole life and even having a Baptist seminary degree.
Yeah.
Because I thought it was ridiculous, right? And
Yeah.
he didn't tell my wife. It wasn't like my wife some flaming Pentecostal trying to make everybody speak in tongues or something.
Right.
That's just her
Right.
background.
She doesn't have a basket of snakes she's carried around. No.
Well, she did have that, but
Oh, okay.
yeah. So anyway, so then we start like that. This is at the end of my seminary, which I turned into 4 years from 3.
Yep.
And then I got this letter from I saw a posting of a job in Colorado Springs for a full-time junior high pastor. I had never heard of such a thing.
Yeah.
Now,
Yeah.
you're young enough to know that these are all over the place. But in
Right.
1981, there were no full-time junior high jobs. There
Right.
were full-time youth pastor jobs, and they were even kind of relatively new for the most part, right? Where you could be
Yep.
full-time, be junior, senior high, college, maybe sometimes children. This job is just junior high, and I'm like, what kind of a church has a position where all you do is junior high? And I love junior high ministry.
Yeah.
Seminary, I had done junior high stuff, and I liked kids so much better than high school kids. So I applied for this job, and it was kind of funny because when I first got a call from the guy became my future supervisor, and
Mhm.
I'm talking on the phone with Russ, and he goes, "Hey, you mentioned that on on your application, your wife comes out of a different background." Of course, I wasn't Presbyterian, so I was kind of surprised. Oh, I didn't tell you, it was First Presbyterian Church, right?
Yeah.
And so I thought, I wasn't sure they'd be interested in a Baptist guy. So they go, he says, "Oh no, we don't care about that. We care about more who you are, what your theology is, where you stand. If you're not a Reformed theology guy, it's okay. We'll talk through some of those things." And he said, "But what's your wife's background?" I said, "Well, she's from Assembly of God." And then Russ says, "Oh, that's my background too." So, so the minister, the reverend, who was going to be my supervisor, was actually Assembly of God background guy who
Yeah.
got involved in in internship at seminary and ended up becoming a Presbyterian. So 2 of the 7 ministers on that staff ordained were Assembly of God guys background.
Oh, all right.
So I knew that was not going to be an issue, and we took that job, and then I was there for well over a decade, and it was just a great fit for me, and for lots of reasons. Part of it was that even though I didn't grow up in a big church, and this was a big church, this was like 5,000-6,000 members, right? Like,
Hmm.
we had 50 some people on staff, right? And these are the kind of things you see all the time nowadays, but I didn't see a lot of that in 1981. But
Right.
I really liked the program element. Like it was a big program church. And I was kind of a good program guy.
Yeah.
Right. So now I know you being a camp guy, you're a program guy too. You can
Right.
run good programs. And it wasn't all about program back in the 80s, but a lot of it was balanced that way.
Yeah.
Right. Like we did big theme kind of events for our Wednesday night youth groups and stuff. And about the time, by the way, that I transitioned to high school for a couple of years in the early 90s. And then I ended up launching this events ministry with a guy from Youth Specialties.
Mm-hmm.
So is Youth Specialties even considered a big deal anymore now? Because it's
No, I don't think so much anymore since the conference went away, and then they merged with DYM there a couple years ago, brought the conference back, then took it away again. So Youth Specialties isn't DYM. I think is more the
yeah,
main
yeah,
line.
yeah. So in the 80s and 90s, though, the Youth Specialties was kind of the big
Huge.
deal.
Yeah.
So my partner was named Todd, and he worked for Youth Specialties, and he was in charge of like they had a high school event called Grow For It. It was a
Mm-hmm.
big deal in the 80s. It would travel around as a 1-day thing, 3 or 4 hours. And we launched the junior high version for Youth Specialties. And then Youth Specialties in 88, they had done so much overreaching in new program areas, they almost went bankrupt. And they also got hit by an earthquake the day before the youth workers annual conference in San Francisco.
Oh,
And they ended up having to pull back that year. And then Todd and I decided to launch this events thing for junior high and do it ourselves.
yeah.
So that's what we did. And so I ended up leaving the church by 92, and we did events for the next few years. So for about the next 8-9 years, I was
Mm-hmm.
producing this junior high event that we basically sold tickets to it. And we'd be in about 60, 70 churches during the year. We'd be in a Friday night, Saturday night, Sunday afternoon, different churches every community. We'd drive, go set up the next place. And it was a real interactive event, but it was high program.
Yeah.
But our whole thing was junior high kids have nothing for them. Everything's always high school based. So
Right.
ours was no high school kids. This is a junior high event, and it's going to be really nonstop, and it's going to have quick changes, and it's going to have junior high kids. We used to say their fingerprints all over it.
Yeah.
So they would help run the tech and all kinds of stuff we would do, and that was really really exciting and really kind of fun. It was also we were perpetually broke. We never got it financially to really make it, but I did that until I finally realized that in about it probably 98, 99, somewhere in there, that it was time. It's like I got to have something stable for my family again. We can't keep doing this forever, living on God knows what's there the next day. We're really self-employed, and when you're self-employed in any business, you're only as good as yesterday's income.
Right.
Because the next day you got to come up, you got payroll, and you got all these things, you got expenses, you got to launch another year, you got marketing costs, and um, so I applied to a couple different churches over about a year and a half time in a few different different places, and uh, either I didn't care for the situation, or one of them was this great job at Lake Avenue Congregational in Pasadena,
All
and
right.
Mark Ostreicher was the executive pastor.
All right.
And Marco, who I'd known for a long time, recruited me actually for a job. It wasn't a youth pastor job. It was like pastor of people in their 30s. It was kind of a
All
cool job.
right.
So, and on staff there, part time was Cara Powell. Like
And
they had
you.
awesome staff at the church, right? It was
Oh
amazing.
yeah. What a lineup.
What a lineup. So, I applied for that church. I was out there a couple times interviewing. Got the call where I thought I was going to come out and look for housing, and I
Mm-hmm.
did not get the job.
Oh.
And it turned out, and at the same time, by the way, Marco had gotten a call that same summer from Yaconelli at
Mm-hmm.
Youth Specialties to come over and be the shocking new president from the outside of Youth Specialty, blowing everybody away.
Yeah.
Marco was on his way out. And in the meantime, I had talked with Kara a little bit. Kara had actually applied for a teaching position at Eastern
Oh.
alongside Duffy Robbins, right?
Yep.
And then she turned it down because she decided she was getting married, and she thought, if we move to the East Coast, my whole life's going to be the East Coast. Family's all in San Diego. And so she decided we're not making the move. And she's the one that told me the job was open because she had turned it down.
Yeah.
And so I saw Duffy at at the Youth Workers Convention. It was actually in Denver that fall. And he had said, oh, yeah, apply for this job. So I ended up doing that. And I applied for that job. Eastern because they had lost Kara, they were in a rough spot because they hit the fall with no one there except Duffy, and he was on the road like he always is. He's not around.
Right.
I actually kind of arranged my own interview and all this stuff. The dean, who was a wonderful woman, almost had Kara Powell, was not impressed with me.
Oh no.
In fact, I totally understand it because I know Kara well,
Oh yeah.
right? Look at her influence, that woman, on youth ministry, right?
Oh yeah.
So if I almost was able to hire Kara, and then I'm looking at Darrell, I'm like, I don't know. So it took her about 3 months to finally offer me the job when no one better was apparently emerging. So I got this offer to start in the January of '99, and so I went I came to Eastern. I spent the first semester. My family stayed in Colorado, and then uh, had a great time working with Duffy. We
Hmm.
worked together for 20 years.
Yeah.
Right. So I was kind of his sidekick because it was two of us for a while. And then Eastern honored the growth of the program because it was growing really well. Youth ministry as a profession and graduates, it was amazing how many we had. I mean, we were the third largest major on the campus many times over the years.
Hmm.
Uh, and then started to decline, for lots of reasons. Right. So youth ministry, and this is still a conversation that comes up, right? I think it's one of your podcast topics, right?
Yeah.
Is it still a legitimate thing,
Yeah.
right? So we kept having fewer and fewer students come, but we actually had 5 full-time faculty members running youth ministry at a point just a few years ago. But then we had a retirement, and the school laid off Eric Crahansel, who had developed the online program, and you knew Eric, I know well, right?
Yeah. Yep.
Because he developed
Reverend
that
Eric.
whole
Yeah.
thing. And then we had another layoff, and then Duffy left for Grove City.
Yep.
So then it came down to it was me. So I was just trying to keep this thing alive the last few years. As I'm getting close to retirement, I'm like, I don't want the program to die. It was very, very interesting time, very tough.
Yeah.
But it was not unusual for schools because almost everybody I knew at schools that had youth ministry programs were struggling for students because after 2008,
Yeah.
that financial collapse hit. A lot of families said to their kids, "You're not going to study anything but business or something that makes money." And so we
Right.
just got less and less students who were interested in going into ministry. And of course, I'm a dad. I understand the whole thing about you don't want your kids to go into huge debt and then make no money. But it was
Right.
interesting to me. I had a lot of conversations with parents in my office who were concerned their kid wanted to be a youth minister, and they were from churches where they have a youth minister
Right.
full time who's in fact impacted their kid enormously. And I would
Right.
go, I don't know how that you don't get excited about that because they're not going to make a fortune, but they're going to have impact on the world. But wow, it was a big transition, 2008, 9. All these numbers started, changing, and oh my gosh, it was very, very different. In the meantime, there's still these youth ministers everywhere.
Right.
Even when the churches started going part-time for a while, they all came back with full-time jobs eventually. Because
Yeah.
guess what? There's still teenagers out there. They're still in communities, and there's still churches, wanting to reach these kids. So I still think it's kind of interesting how, the Hunter Taylors of the world are all over the place. We have
Yeah.
tons of them in this country who are paid. I assume you're paid. You're not working for
Yeah.
free, right? They do pay you
No.
something,
Yeah. I
right?
get. Yeah.
So somehow the church found money and said we need to pay this guy.
Right.
But the perception for a long time has been from parents like, uh, yeah, I don't want my kid to go into that.
Right.
Very, very frustrating. You mentioned in a little or in that bio on me about, I actually go to a Chinese church now, which is kind of its own long story I won't get into, but I'm actually considered one of the pastors, so I'm
Hmm.
unpaid most of the time, and I speak once in a while. Um, but in the Chinese church community, they're a youth pastor network. They always call them English pastors, but they're usually the youth pastor. Huge gap right now. They can't find anybody.
Hmm.
Because the same problem, because their own churches aren't raising up kids who the families want to become ministry. So all the kids get out and they're like, where are you going to school? Oh, I'm going off to study science or mechanical engineering or, music, things that
Right.
Asians tend to do, but rarely ministry. Rarely,
Yeah.
rarely, rarely. So then when the church is looking for somebody, well, there's no pot of potential employees out there. So very strange, very strange. But in the meantime, youth ministry is still a pretty big thing.
Yeah. Yeah, it is. I mean, there's death. I was joking the other day, death, taxes, and youth ministry. It's always going to be
Yeah, that's
so.
good.
Um,
Taxes.
but
Are there are Is there a priority on those things at all? You think on those three things?
I think you should probably figure out how you feel about death, and then you got to pay your taxes. I think in that order, yeah, death, taxes, then
Okay,
youth ministry.
okay. And by the way, probably with uh youth ministry salaries, you don't have to worry about paying too much tax generally.
Right. And
No one makes a fortune in youth ministry, right? So
right.
no one can figure out like how do I hide $1 million of income here?
Right.
Tax.
Yeah, I don't think that's at least not listen, not how I know youth ministry.
There,
Maybe
there are
someone's out.
there are a few out there. They're genius. They're usually pretty big time folks, right?
Yeah.
Who put big organizations together and things or companies. But by and large, no. We go into youth ministry and we're not thinking like we're going to make a fortune. We expect to
Right.
make enough money to get by, have a family,
Yep.
buy a car, have a house.
Yeah.
Uh, Generally, is true.
Right.
But we make a lot less money than a lot of jobs around us.
Oh yeah, for sure. So I want to hear the Chinese church story because I don't know it.
Well, in 2009, I was finishing my doctorate of ministry courses,
Hmm.
and my last class was actually uh, in New York City. We were in
Okay.
Manhattan for a week together, and it was on multi-ethnic ministry, multicultural ministry. And
Yep.
so we were all over New York, visiting all these churches, these multi-ethnic churches and stuff. Of course, New York has tons of these churches, right?
Yeah.
Where you have all kinds, because you have places like we were in Queens, which is the most ethnically diverse community they say in the world.
All right.
Queens is amazing,
Yeah.
and so we're visiting these churches in Queens and stuff, and we had a great textbook, uh, uh, on the whole called I think it was like United by Faith. It was a group written project about the authors. Their contention was the church is supposed to be multicultural and multi-ethnic in makeup from
Hmm.
Pentecost on. And I kind of agree with that. I kind of think that's how it was supposed to be, not just Jews, the Gentiles and everybody, right?
Yeah.
So and of course our problem in America is that we don't live in multi-ethnic communities, so it's not very easy. And I remember coming back. We had this evangelical Episcopal church that we were a part of, and pretty much a white church, right, in the
Yeah.
suburb. And I'm like, well, how do we become a multi-ethnic church? Then one of my colleagues calls me one day at Eastern. He's a chemistry prof, and he says, "My wife's the pastor of this Chinese church, and would you come guest speak some Sunday?" And I said, "Sure." I mean, this is like 2 weeks after my class ended. And in my journal, I have the note, "What does this mean for me? This multi-ethnic thing?"
Yeah.
And then I get invited to speak at this church, this little church of 25 people renting someone else's building.
Yeah.
And and I got asked back, and I did that about once a month for that year. And then that church was in the process of trying to figure out how do we become multi or bilingual every Sunday.
Hmm.
So during that year, they made the decision. We because they were having what happens with all immigrant churches. Immigrant churches start with you have all these people from some place. My background in Minnesota was all these Scandinavians who came and they had Swedish churches.
Yeah.
But eventually, guess what? The kids are born in America and they're not speaking Swedish.
Right.
They're speaking English, right? So Swedish kind of keeps doing this, and English keeps growing. Same thing with Chinese, right? So these people come and they have these communities. They have their cultural connections. Then they have children, and the children grow up American, and their kids are like, we don't understand church because even though you send us to Chinese school every Saturday, we don't understand it, and they kind of lose interest, right? So um, basically, the church made this decision to become bilingual, by
Hmm.
having every service be sung simultaneously English and Mandarin. And then after the worship and announcements and everything was done, to split into 2 sermons, English sermon, Mandarin sermon. And so me, along with my colleague Jeff, the one who had invited me, his wife Anna is the pastor, he and I would rotate speaking to the English congregation, which was about 20 people. The meantime, the Mandarin congregation was like 100, 150. It grew like crazy, right?
Yeah.
Then once a month, the church stays together for translated sermons, right?
All right.
So that's how I became part of this Chinese church. So it's always kind of funny because like I got no Chinese. I'm a complete Scandinavian.
Yeah.
And then, but my wife, of course, well, she's almost complete Scandinavian too, right? So she's
Right.
almost total Norwegian herself. So we had a very interesting entry into that. Oh, and then the church asked me to start a youth ministry that year to help me out, and we started a youth ministry. We learned a lot about Chinese kids and cultural changes. I had to learn a whole new thing because every
Yeah.
context is different. I had done big youth ministry stuff. I had not done small, ethnic, very unique, very, very fun, but different. One of the big things, by the way, that was a shocker was when I first took that job at the church, they said, well, we talk about youth ministry, event every week. And I said, well, I would like to aim for Sunday night because I think most youth groups meet on Sunday night, right? And they looked at me like I was crazy. They're like, Sunday night? And I said, yeah, that's when most youth groups meet. And I said, but I'm open to Wednesday because I did Wednesday for well over a decade. And I'm used to the midweek kind of youth group. And they go, midweek? See, these are school nights, Sunday night, Wednesday night. Asian community, there's only one night that works for youth groups. And you'll see this in virtually every Asian church you ever come across. Guess what night they have for a youth group? Friday.
Really?
And I was like, Friday? I don't want to have youth group on Friday.
Right. I don't.
Wife and I go out to eat on Fridays. Like, that's like a fun free night. And
Yeah.
don't get like school stuff, right? Like sports and things. But that we did. So we did every other Friday night. We had youth group that first year.
All
And
right.
and then that eventually, and I had interns help me from school with that one, coming over. And we all learned a lot. We did that for a couple of years. And then the church actually grew enough that they end up hiring a guy who's amazing. Name's Dan Au. He's our English pastor. He's the English pastor for the English congregation, but he's really the youth pastor too. And he's brilliant, amazing guy. And it's funny because when I first met him, he was young with a wife and young kid, and I said, "You're the first guy I've ever met in these Asian churches that actually went to seminary, like followed a call to seminary." He goes, "Actually, I was a family doctor before I decided to go to seminary." Like he'd gone to medical school.
Yeah.
Hunter, have you ever heard about this? In my community, I'd never heard of this. Fast tracking through medical school.
No, I've never.
I had never heard that. Guess what? In the Asian community, not unusual. So, like Dan, our youth pastor, he got fast tracked at Northwestern University to go to go straight bachelor's through his medical doctor degree straight through in a few years. Which
Really?
is what he did. But he actually comes from a long line of medical missionaries, Hong Kong
Oh,
based. And so for him, it was not unusual to have a medical background, but then be a minister. So
right.
he's this brilliant guy who, by the way, he has the best illustrations when it comes to anything about, illness or life or the body, because he
Yeah.
knows his stuff.
Oh, yeah.
He's a doctor. So anyway, it's been very interesting. And one of the funniest things about going to this church is that it is loaded with PhDs in the sciences and computer science, and physical sciences and natural. It's loaded with all these high educated people. But only one person gets called doctor. That is me. They call me Dr. Pearson, Dr. Pearson.
Yeah.
And my wife and I think it's because my name has R's and L's and is difficult to pronounce because everybody else's first name, but somehow
Yeah.
I'm doctor. And I'm around all these I'm a doctor of ministry. I'm sorry, it's not as intense as a PhD,
Right.
right? It's a more like a M.Div glorified, it's ongoing ministry, practical.
Yeah.
But that's what I call the church. So I'm Dr. Pearson at the church. but
Yeah.
no one else in my life have I been called doctor.
That's
So it's
awesome.
pretty funny, but it's been fun. But you know what? To go back to the whole thing about becoming a part of it, it's never been the socially, culturally comfortable place for us because it's not necessarily the people we would hang around with or what they do with their time on the side. But it's been really good for us to be stretched into something different.
Yeah.
So I think it's not a bad thing sometimes to in life go, okay, how do we do something a little more multi-ethnic or multicultural? And of course, nowadays there's a lot more churches that represent that. Now, you're out kind of in the middle of Michigan.
Yeah.
You're probably not in a very high multi-ethnic community, right? So your church is going to
Nope.
represent what your community is. But you go to Detroit and you're going to find some pretty interesting churches that are more multi-ethnic, not just a black church anymore or a
Right.
Hispanic church, but they're going to be more combined of things, right? So that's been a good thing for me, and kind of fun sometimes to, I'll get to preach the translated sermon for the combined congregations. That's always kind
Yep.
of fun. You've done that on missions trips, probably, uh,
Yeah.
someplace. That's kind of a cool deal to do, but it's all sometimes it's always good to go to do something you never expected, right? Like
Yeah.
I my career, I basically had three different vocations, right? Three different jobs, but all one vocation in ministry, and so when I got out of seminary, I became a junior high pastor. I understood that. I knew what that was, and I did that for a decade. Then I became this junior high events guy where I was traveling around. I was really basically a junior high comedian,
Mm-hmm.
traveling around doing these 3-4 hour events three times every weekend. Um, but it was a whole different. I never envisioned something like that,
Right.
but it was still ministry. It was still junior high kids focused. And then I certainly never imagined myself becoming a college professor. If you saw my college grades, you would know not likely college professor material. And
Right.
yet I ended up doing, because actually teaching college in a practical ministry degree had more to do with what your experience has been as opposed to what kind of degrees do you have.
Right.
So all that, my whole career ends up being one vocation, but three very different jobs, none of which I could have imagined. And even what I'm doing now, like there's another local Chinese church I speak at once or twice a month on the side. And they have church in the afternoon, and it's closer to where I live than my own church. And because I got recommended by my own church, I'm over at that thing. So I'm becoming like this little pseudo, I guess, Chinese sermon specialist. I don't know what I'm doing. Well, who would have ever thought that? I would never have thought that in my life.
Right.
But it's really kind of neat to have things that you go, oh, never saw that coming.
Yeah.
But that's kind of fulfilling
Yeah.
in a unique way.
Yeah. God does some pretty cool stuff.
Really
Um,
tough.
yeah, some really cool stuff, and never would have expected. Um, I feel that. So now you're retired. How? So the whole purpose of podcasting, you shared a lot of it. How God's been faithful in your life, and that's been so cool and encouraging. But as you've transitioned into retirement and things have changed a little bit in your life, how have you seen some of God's faithfulness lately
Well, it's a little bit of what I just talked about a little
with
bit.
the Chinese church? Yeah.
That I'm doing some things that I would not have expected I would have done. And I'm not really doing much. Like I don't do much with my church's youth ministry, really.
Hmm.
Very rarely do I do anything anymore. I used to kind of fill in, or but I'm not like a volunteer. Maybe I should be, but I'm not really helping out that way. But I'm still doing kind of randomly once in a while. Like last year, the local Chinese church ministry association needed a speaker for their retreat,
Hmm.
and I jumped in and filled in, and I was the weekend speaker. Right, I'm doing less of those things because I'm older. I
Right.
still connect with kids okay, but I'm not, it's not as good as when you're 30 or 35 and it's just
Right.
it's a better connection. But it's kind of fun to be able to step in and go, I've done this a few times, maybe a few hundred times. So
Yeah.
you don't have to worry. By the way, it was pretty funny when they signed me up to do that. Because all these Asian churches, by the way, they're all in their own little circles, right?
Hmm.
They don't function outside of that stuff very much. They're very much in the Chinese church community is kind of its own thing. And so one of the pastors wrote me this email, and he said, thank you for signing up to be our um, speaker for this retreat. The parents have a couple of questions. One is, they had two questions. One of them was, "Are you Calvinist or Armenian?" And then question 2 was, "Where do you stand on critical race theory?"
Those are the two.
And I thought about it a lot, and I finally wrote this guy back, and I go, "All right, in 40 some years of ministry, no one has ever asked me whether I was a Calvinist or an Arminian.
Yeah.
Maybe they would make assumptions. I worked in a Presbyterian church and,
Right.
Baptist. And so I wrote this long response, but I was like, this was the most fascinating thing. I did the retreat. It went fine, by the way. But anyway,
Yeah.
so I guess sometimes to realize that there's still a role, and then so God's faithful to still have a purpose in your life.
Hmm.
And I've seen guys 20, 30 years older than me still really active doing ministry stuff. I don't
Yeah.
see that happening for me.
No.
I don't think so. I think the retirement's a good thing for the most part, right? But
Yeah.
I think more power to them sometimes when people can do that and and people have a role. I think that's great. I think that more directly, the issue for me is trying to figure out finances.
Yeah.
So, um, I used to joke. I don't know. You probably have a good plan. You're a pretty thoughtful guy. You probably have a whole retirement plan figured out,
Well,
and you're putting in. You got 5-6 million put aside already.
at least. At
Yeah,
least.
you can't even keep up with interest growing so fast.
Right.
Because I had started a business in the 90s and I invested everything I had in credit cards. We're basically bankrupt almost for years.
Hmm.
It took me years to kind of recover. And then by the time I got into, within 10 years of what would be retirement, I realized I'm not really set for retirement. And people would say, well, what do you think you're going to retire? And I would make it into a joke. I would always say, well, my goal is I'm going to follow the Bilbo Baggins plan. Right. So Bilbo had his birthday party at 11.
Yep.
Well, that's my retirement goal, 111. And since I'll never live that old, I won't have to worry about retirement.
Right.
And then there came a point where I realized I can't keep joking about this because reality is going to hit me. And then 6 years ago, I had a little stroke,
Yep.
and that threw a new wrench into things to go like, oh my gosh, what does this mean? And then my wife retired that year. She worked with autistic kids in our local school district. And very demanding job, very hard. And she just one day she said, I can't go past Christmas. I'm done.
Hmm.
So I had to start figuring things out. And then as I started really trying to figure out what we were going to do, I realized this is not as bad a scenario as I thought. So part of the God's faithfulness was not just that you have to think about working till you're 111,
Right.
because you have no other income, but to realize, this might come out better than you think, right? So I know for youth ministers, when you look at your life income, when you're young, often, you don't care about your income that much, right? Most youth ministers they're not trying to get buy multiple vacation homes in a new car. So
Right.
they're more focused on life and real important things and their own family and things. So, uh, they're not after the almighty dollar. But when you get a little older, there's a point where you start realizing you look around at people near you or, around you in your church who are your age and you go, they make a lot more money than me. They're clearly set up better for actually retiring. So I found it encouraging to realize that God's faithfulness for me was going to be maybe you can actually retire and it's going to be okay because between, some 401k money you've done since you started at Eastern, so there's some of
Yep.
that you got equity in your house. Uh, you know, we've owned 3 houses in all since seminary. One of my seminary professors said one of his piece of advice was buy the biggest house you can afford because you can deduct it all on your, minister, the tax thing, right? That was a big thing
Yeah.
back. And I was never ordained, so I couldn't do that. But we could deduct our interest of our home mortgage, right?
Mhm.
Not any longer. That's different nowadays.
Yep.
Um, I like that these laws changed. By the way, I think they're good um, because there are better other overall deductions for people, right? I think it works out pretty good. But basically, we always had more house than we should have been able to afford, and we put more money into our house than into travel, for example.
Right.
So, but what that meant partly was that by the time we got now to our age, we have a good home equity because we built it up over 3 houses. And we only lived in 2 places since seminary, which is amazing.
Yeah.
Highly never expected that, by the way. I thought, oh, 5 years in some place and moving to a new church. But that really, that's been helpful for us. Turns out Social Security, not the terrible, awful thing or evil or something. It's like, it's actually a helpful item when you get older.
Yeah.
Right. And there's actually money there. Now, obviously what happens long-term with Social Security, they got to address that one of these days. Someone's got to be bright enough to go, we got to answer these questions, right? Because they can't just keep, I'm a boomer. There's more of us retiring every day, probably. So, but anyway, it's actually, it's a pretty good program, and it comes in kind of handy. One of my brothers got laid off by his church when he was 62, and it's hard to find a new job when you're 62 because everybody wants to hire young.
Yeah.
And he needed to go on Social Security before he wanted to, but it was there.
Right.
So part of God's faithfulness, oddly, this is probably not Dave Ramsey stuff, actually says, this is part of the provision that you've been paying into your whole life, helping, and then there's going to be this money that comes, it's going to be coming every month for you. And then, by the way, expenses go down when you get old.
Yeah, I imagine they do.
So there's a lot of things that actually, including taxes.
Yeah.
I mean, next year when I'm in my first kind of real year of retirement and stuff, my federal tax bill is going to be the smallest it's probably been since 1985 or something. Because I just don't owe as much tax. Because, I live in a state where the state doesn't tax your retirement income or Social Security, so you're getting some money that you don't pay taxes on. So I could look at my old income from like Eastern and go, I can make a lot less because I'm not putting money into taxes. I don't have to put money into Social Security anymore.
Right.
They don't take that out anymore because I'm not. So you can actually live on less. It's like, so I think part of the faithfulness thing is to go, maybe this isn't as scary as I thought it was going to be. And I've tried to, I did a seminar once for some, on a Zoom thing with some local youth ministers to talk about, I don't know if anybody's worried about retirement, because when you're 30 years old, you're not thinking about it very much, but it's maybe good to keep in mind that it might just work out okay.
Yeah.
It might not work out, and you don't have to work till you're 100, or you don't have to, think that you could never retire. If someone works in a denomination and you're an ordained person, they have some pretty good things set up to help pastors, right?
Yeah.
So if you're part of the main denomination thing, every denomination I know cares about their pastors and what they do in retirement. But that's kind of a God's provision thing, but through surprising things. I'm not sitting having to wait around for like love offerings to come in the mail or something.
Right.
And then like I mentioned earlier, maybe we were just chatting about it, but having some of these other churches I'm speaking at, it's a little honorarium here and there. It turns out that's more helpful than I thought I was going to need.
Yeah.
So helpful.
Yeah, God does a pretty good job at taking care of his kids, doesn't he?
Yeah, and by the way, if I go back to the 90s was my toughest decade of my life.
Yeah.
When I was self-employed. And so I went from having, a good church position, I'm paid adequately, to where I was barely making it. We were living on nothing for a number of years, actually, very little, trying to keep a business going, very tough. And that's probably when I learned the most about God's faithfulness and provision, because I was stressed all the time about money.
Yeah.
But, we always ate. We always had food. We never lost our house, it was always, and I realized that in some ways I become more dependent on thinking about people helping out, and not that God can take care of things.
Yeah.
And God does that through people sometimes, right? In great ways. But like there was one Christmas where the first year I left my church, and we were so in the hole on our business, and there was just no income. And someone put $100 on our windshield. And I came out the car, and here's this wad of cash, $100. It paid for Christmas. 92 for us. It bought the gifts, it paid for whatever we did, a tree, anything. And I never knew who put that money there. So I could never, when someone gives you something anonymously, it's really kind of cool, but it's also kind of frustrating, because now you can't dislike anybody, because you might be angry with somebody who's actually the one who put the money in your windshield, right? So it's kind of good that it's anonymous.
Yeah.
Uh, but that was a pretty big family story for us, and that happened a couple times.
Yeah.
Where someone did that, and there was that kind of thing where provision sometimes came through. The biggest gift I ever got in the '90s wasn't from people I know with money. It was actually from a church custodian in Seattle, Washington, who sent me 25.
Just
And he wouldn't, when I called the church to find out who this guy was, and the youth pastor's like, "Oh yeah, I know Sean well. He's our custodian." I'm like, "What?" His last name was Packard. I thought he was related to Hewlett Packard or something, right?
oh yeah.
And he was not. It was Seattle too, I was thinking. So this guy wouldn't tell me on the phone why he sent me this money. But it took a few months later, I was back at his church again, and he told me the story that he'd been through a divorce. And he said, God made it clear to me that the only thing I owned was our house. And he said, because it came from your sinful situation of your divorce, you have to give away all your half of the money of your equity. And he said, God laid on his heart 7 different people and organizations to give the money to. And he sent me $2,500. Now,
Wow.
when that happens, and that came randomly in a check in the middle of a summer when we were desperate. And it's when you're in your toughest times. That's when you learn that provision.
Yeah.
When you're in your most times of feast, you don't learn those things. So that was the kind of thing that's like, I have to make sure I never forget this.
Yeah.
Because that provision for my family was unbelievable. Now, I've also said once in a while, I said, it would have been pretty cool if I gotten $25,000, because that would have solved a lot of problems, right? Or maybe 250. Let's keep it going up, right?
Right.
I'd like, yeah, no, you just screw that money. You just mess it up and whatever. So, you get what you need.
Yeah.
But when things are kind of tough, and this is partly why I think in youth ministry, we're for the most part pretty balanced people, because we never live on big incomes. We got to make do with what we have, and then we see the benefits in our own family. Like a lot of youth pastors I know with their own families and kids, they got these great little units of mission oriented family.
Mm-hmm.
It isn't pushed aside by having too much money.
Right.
But a lot of youth workers work in churches where you got kids with way too much money, and you realize not always great having too much money.
Yeah.
Sometimes it's nice to be kind of frugal
Yeah.
and have to live thrifty, right? So that the '90s for me was a pretty big thing, and I've never forgotten those lessons about what it felt like to be so on the edge, but then realize sometimes God comes through with things that stun you.
Yeah. Yeah. That's awesome. Yeah, he's faithful. He takes care of his people for sure. So I want to wrap up with a few moments of let's get your thoughts or ideas on how does somebody who's in that season like you were in the 90s where it's tough and we're going through transition, or we are scraping the bottom of the barrel, like what are some it's a key thought or idea, piece of advice that you'd give to that person who's struggling right now to see God's faithfulness in the midst of struggle?
Well, I think part of it is you've got to take the long view,
Right.
right? You've got to take a long view and say, what have I seen happen with what I've done with my life up to this point? Because no matter how frustrating ministry can be, and sometimes people are in a really bad church or position, or they got great kids, but they have a pastor they don't get along with, right? Very tense, very stressful. But it's often, to do that long view and go like, what are the kids I've worked with? Where are they at? What have they benefited from, right? Like, it's not until you leave a community and all these kids are crying over your leaving, you realize, oh man, maybe I had something to do with this.
Yeah.
And of course they'll get on, because everybody has to get on with their life after other people leave their ministry in their life. But that's a pretty cool thing to look at, right? Because you in most jobs you don't get to see that very good. People in service things like teaching and ministry, they get to see this.
Yeah.
uh, I've always had that really cool advantage of being able to look at people in my life. This is part of why I actually like Facebook a lot. Though I don't do it much, really. I kind of, that was something I was going to do in retirement. I was going to post on Facebook often, and I don't know, not once in a year.
Yeah.
But what I love about Facebook is seeing what students I had decades ago are doing now.
Yeah.
Right. So the long view, what have you invested yourself in, is a remarkable thing. My wife and I were we visited our old church, Colorado Springs, in September. We were out for a little family reunion, and we went back to our church, and we basically only told a couple people we were going to be there. We just kind of want to show up and get to see stuff. And so we got to, after church, met with the executive pastor, is a gal named Jennifer Oriker Holtz. And Jennifer was actually a junior high kid of ours
Oh yeah. That's
in
awesome.
the 80s, into the early 90s when she was a student at the church. And she remains the only junior high student I ever had who said she received her call to ministry in junior high. Like, I knew a lot of people who in high school or college followed a call into ministry, and I always felt like I had a part of their life when they were really younger. But Jennifer's the only one who said, no, I was called to ministry in junior high. And I've kept up with her good over all these years. Really fun to see her role in that big church that she grew up in, and she's the executive pastor. Actually, she's got a little different title now. It's too fancy for me to even remember what it is. But when you sit there in the pew for me a couple months ago and look at that and think, this is part of my story. I got to be a part of that.
Yeah.
It's not like you go, boy, what a great job. I got all these people. I did, it's more that you got to be a part of that story for them. And this working with junior high kids, you have a different impact than high school kids.
Right.
Junior high kids are often, you just loved them through a tough time. Whereas high school kids, you have a chance to really give them a different kind of vision and strategic kind of thinking about their future.
Yeah.
So I think to take the long term to go, if I'm faithful, keep doing this, what does this mean down the road? It probably means a lot of really satisfying and fulfilling things in your life that you get to look back on.
Yeah.
And that's pretty cool. And a lot of people don't get that. But when you were on the wilderness class with me, remember we stayed in the house in Canyon City?
Yeah.
One of my friends' places, right?
Yep.
So he wasn't there. He didn't come out that time.
Right.
But he's a retired finance guy for General Mills. It was a big investment. Great guy. He told me once, like, our jobs are so different because mine was all people jobs. And he said, the worst day I have at General Mills is when someone comes into my office with a problem and I have to talk to somebody. Now in retirement, he's got all these things going. He's working on, he's a part of investment thing. He's actually, for 30 years, he's been part of the retirement investment counseling group over my old denomination's pastor's retirement fund.
Oh, nice.
Like, he's got a ministry for all that stuff.
Yeah.
But I'll tell you what he doesn't have on Facebook. He doesn't have people from General Mills sending me notes that say, hey, thanks for what you did, blah, 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 back in the, none, because
Right.
that's not how the business finance world works that way, right?
Right.
And I get that. I get it. People send things to me, post things to me. I made a comment from one of my former students who we got to see when we were in the church a couple months ago. He was a great kid. He's a detective for the Springs Police now. And we got a chance to kind of catch up a little bit. And that came about partly because he had posted something about the Denver Nuggets winning. And I had sent him a picture of me in a Denver Nuggets t-shirt, 1979. And it said, I grew up as a Nuggets fan. And then he's like, oh my gosh, I want to see you again one of these days because you had such an impact on my life. Who gets that in most jobs in this world?
Right. Teachers and youth pastors.
I get those things all the time, because they're they're the byproduct of being faithful.
Right.
They're I want to call them a reward. They're not a reward to go like, oh, you did all that hard work. Now you get to hear some good things. No, it's a byproduct of being a part of the ministry and mission. But that's a pretty cool deal. A lot of jobs don't have that. And a lot of people, it's why they change careers at some point.
Yeah.
Go into ministry. Because what they've been doing, they find very unfulfilling. They go, what's the point long term of this?
Yeah.
Who cares?
Right.
I want to impact people. So they end up, like what you're doing, coaching.
Yeah.
I'm sure there's many people who end up coaching as a sideline go, this is what I need to be doing is working with kids.
Yeah.
Even in athletics, maybe not in a church or something, right? Because there's a benefit to that, right? That they're really getting to see now that they maybe don't see in their accounting firm.
Right. Right. Yeah. No, that's awesome. All right. Well, we're running low on time. So I just want to thank you for giving an hour of your Thursday morning. I know you got a little bit extra time in retirement, but it's still valuable.
It's good. By the way, I have to say something, Hunter. Up on
Yeah.
that top shelf, up above up above there, you see that? Do you
Mhm.
remember that little? All the
I
mementos
do.
of my wilderness classes because your name is signed on that spine.
Yes, it
Remember
is.
that? Your
I
name
do
is on
remember that.
I picked the spot because I thought, yeah, there's a little Hunter Taylor thing right up there.
Yeah. That's what a time. That was an amazing trip. Just a really cool group. Um, to be able to spend. It was really cold sleeping in my hammock in the side of the mountain. Um, I
Yeah,
still remember the switchbacks from hell. That was getting up to your guys' cabin was a good time.
yeah,
Um,
yeah. No, that was my final class, obviously, and
yeah,
stressful, partly because of my age.
yeah,
But having some guys like you that when I knew you were going on that trip, I thought it took a lot of worries off of it for me,
yeah.
frankly, because I
Oh,
knew
good.
your experience, your maturity, your the way you are with other people, and I saw that the whole time in that class, right?
Yeah,
Because we have people theologically some real different things on that class, and yet you're gonna argue your point strong, but with grace,
yeah.
which is the way you're supposed to do it. So that was
Right.
the fun part of that, is to watch you function on that class.
That was a good trip.
I was struggling to keep breathing.
I tell you what, and Tim and I were talking about this during the trip. How impressed we were with you trudging along. I mean, you kept along with all us young folk pretty well. You were sagging back every now and again, but for
I
the
did
most
okay for
part,
the most part, but yeah, my post stroke classes, I did two of them. Were
yeah,
tough that way, right? Because I used to be like what you can do if you run a youth group camping trip.
yeah,
If you have to, you're the guy who can throw someone on your back and haul them out of the place.
right,
Not me anymore. The last few years, right? So
right,
I would have to throw someone on your back,
yeah. Well,
which is
I'd carry that for you.
long. Because I thought I would have to throw me on your back.
Right. Well, we could have handled it. We could have got you
But
killed it. No,
anyway, I had to mention that one up that your name's up there above my head. So
yeah, no, that's cool. And I just want to say, really appreciate. Would not have gotten through the 4 years at Eastern without you, your wisdom, your direction, your advice. So you're someone I look up to in ministry and aspire to be to when I get to your age. So really appreciate that.
all right, man. We'll talk soon.
So
Do this again, maybe.
yeah, definitely. Yeah, we will catch you later. But until next time, this has been In Real Time.